What happens when the promise of a new life becomes a public condemnation? For Anneliese Schmidt, the long journey to the Western Territories ended not with a wedding, but with a single damning word whispered by a doctor: pregnant. Her intended groom, a man of supposed wealth and standing, cast her out before the entire town, leaving her shamed, penniless, and carrying a secret she thought she had left buried in the past. Left to the mercy of the harsh wilderness, her salvation and her child's future would come from a place she least expected, a wounded stranger, an outcast whose silent honor would challenge everything the civilized world had taught her. This is the story of a brutal rejection that forged an unbreakable family in the heart of an unforgiving land. The stagecoach rattled into Obsidian Ridge under a sun that seemed determined to bake the very hope from the sky. For Anneliese Schmidt, every jolt and shudder was a punctuation mark at the end of a long, desperate sentence. She clutched the worn photograph in her reticule, the image of a man with a severe face and a neatly trimmed mustache. Mr. Bartholomew Finch. His letters had been poetry filled with promises of a fine house of respectability and of a future untainted by the shadows she was fleeing. Obsidian Ridge was less a town and more a raw wound on the face of the earth. A single dusty street was flanked by raw timber buildings, their facades squinting in the relentless glare. The saloon, the general store, the assayer's office, and a looming two-story structure with fresh white paint that could only be the Finch residence. It stood apart, an arrogant declaration of prosperity amidst the grit. A man matching the photograph stood on the porch of that very house, his posture as rigid as a fence post. He was flanked by a woman with a face like a clenched fist, Mrs. Gable, the town's foremost purveyor of gossip and judgment, who had been appointed to inspect the merchandise. Miss Schmidt, I presume Bartholomew said, his voice smoother than his letters, but lacking their warmth. He didn't offer a hand, merely gestured for her to ascend the steps. Anneliese, weary to her bones, managed a curtsy. Mr. Finch. It is an honor. The inside of the house was a shock of opulence. Polished mahogany furniture, velvet curtains that blocked the cruel sun, and a grandfather clock that ticked with ponderous authority. It was a gilded cage, and Anneliese felt the lock turning before she had even stepped fully inside. Mrs. Gable circled her like a vulture, her sharp eyes cataloguing every detail of Anneliese's worn traveling dress, the fraying cuffs, the dust settled into the seams. She's a bit pale, Bartholomew, and thin. Scarcely strong enough for frontier life, I'd wager. She will suffice, Finch said, with the air of a man assessing livestock. She is comely enough, and her letters suggest a docile temperament. The journey had taken its toll in more ways than one. The constant nausea, the dizzy spells she had attributed to the rocking of the coach and the poor food, suddenly washed over her in a great sickening wave. The room tilted, the ticking of the clock growing into a roar in her ears. She reached out for the back of a chair, her knuckles white, before the world dissolved into blackness. She awoke on a velvet settee, the sharp medicinal scent of ammonia stinging her nostrils. A portly man with kind, tired eyes was leaning over her. This was Doc Hemlock. Bartholomew and Mrs. Gable stood by the fireplace, their expressions a mixture of impatience and suspicion. Just a simple faint, most likely, the doctor said, patting her hand. The journey is arduous. Let me just check your vitals to be certain. His examination was gentle and professional. He listened to her heart, checked the pulse at her wrist, and then with a furrowed brow, his experienced hands gently palpated her abdomen. He paused. His eyes, which had been merely kind, were now filled with a profound pity. He straightened up slowly, his gaze shifting to Bartholomew Finch. Mr. Finch, Doc Hemlock began, his voice low and heavy. "Perhaps we could speak in private." "Nonsense," Finch snapped. "Whatever ails her is my business now. Speak plainly." The doctor took a deep breath, his gaze falling on Annalise, who was struggling to sit up. "Mom." "Miss Schmidt, there's no easy way to say this. You are with child. I'd estimate you're into your 4th month." The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any stone. Mrs. Gable let out a theatrical gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Annalise felt the blood drain from her face, a cold dread seeping into her bones. It was the secret she had prayed would remain hidden long enough for her to secure her new life, the tragic legacy of a love lost and a promise broken. Bartholomew Finch's face transformed. The thin veneer of civility cracked and fell away, revealing a countenance of pure, unadulterated rage. His eyes, which had been cold, now burned with a venomous fire. "Get her out!" He hissed the words tight and sharp as shards of glass. "Bartholomew, please," Annalise whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I can explain. My fiancé. There was an accident." "Explain." He laughed, a short, ugly bark that held no humor. "You dare to speak of explanations. You are a harlot, a deceitful fallen woman who traveled here under false pretenses to foist another man's bastard upon me. You have tried to taint my name, my home." He strode over to her, his face a mask of disgust. He didn't strike her, which was somehow worse. He simply pointed a trembling finger at the door. "Mrs. Gable, see that this creature is removed from my property. Her trunk is to be thrown into the street after her. She is not to be given shelter. She is not to be given a single crumb of bread. I want this town to understand what happens to those who attempt to defraud Bartholomew Finch." Mrs. Gable, energized by the scandal, grabbed Annalise's arm with surprising strength. Annalise, weak and reeling from the revelation, could not resist. She was dragged from the opulent house down the pristine steps and shoved into the unforgiving dust of the main street. Her small trunk landed beside her with a splintering crack, its contents spilling out a few meager dresses, a worn Bible, and the photograph of a young, smiling man who was now 6 feet under the soil back in Ohio. The townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, stared. They were silent, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and stern judgment. Annalise Schmidt, the mail-order bride, had been rejected. She was alone, exposed and branded a pariah, before she had even known a single day of peace. The gilded cage had opened only to cast her into the wilderness. The sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and blood. The shadows of the buildings stretched across the street like long, pointing fingers, each one an accusation. Annalise gathered her spilled belongings, her hands trembling so violently she could barely grasp the worn fabric of her dresses. The stares of the townsfolk were a physical weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. No one spoke a word. No one offered a hand. Mr. Finch's decree had been absolute. She had nowhere to go. The return journey was an impossibility, a multi-week ordeal for which she had no money and no strength. The hotel would refuse her. The church, she suspected, would offer sermons on sin, but no sanctuary. Her shame was a tangible thing, a cloak of disgrace she was forced to wear. With what little dignity she could muster, she dragged her broken trunk to the edge of town, past the last of the ramshackle houses and the blacksmith's forge, where the rhythmic clang of the hammer sounded like a funeral toll. The landscape opened up into a brutal vista of rock scrub and distant, unforgiving mesas. The wind picked up, carrying with it a mournful howl and the first cold promise of a storm. Dark clouds boiled on the horizon, moving with an unnatural speed. A flicker of lightning illuminated a structure she hadn't noticed before, tucked into a small ravine carved by a long-dead creek. It was a line shack, an old, dilapidated cabin likely used by ranchers or prospectors, and since abandoned. Its roof was sagging, and the door hung from a single leather hinge, but it was shelter. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall cold and hard as pebbles, Annalise scrambled down the rocky incline, dragging her trunk behind her. The door groaned in protest as she pushed it open, revealing a single dark room, thick with the smell of dust rot and something else, something metallic and feral. She stepped inside, just as the heavens opened, the rain coming down in a torrential, deafening sheet. In the gloom, her eyes struggled to adjust. A rough-hewn table, an overturned chair, a stone fireplace filled with old ash, and in the far corner, a pile of what looked like dirty blankets. A low groan emanated from the pile. Annalise froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She was not alone. The blankets shifted, and a man sat up, his movements slow and pained. For a moment, she couldn't make out his features in the dim light. Then, a brilliant fork of lightning lit the entire sky, illuminating the interior of the shack for a split second. The man was Native American. His hair was long and black, matted with dirt and something darker. His face was lean, his features sharp and defined, but twisted in pain. His buckskin shirt was torn and soaked through with blood from a vicious wound on his side. Another jagged cut marred his forehead. He was feverish. His eyes glazed with delirium as he stared at her, not with malice, but with a primal confusion, like a cornered animal. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Annalise's despair. All the stories she had heard, the whispers of savages and raids, flooded her mind. She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Her first instinct was to run, to flee back into the storm and take her chances with the elements. But she stopped. She looked at the man, truly looked at him, and saw not the boogeyman from campfire tales, but a fellow creature in immense pain. His skin was slick with sweat, his breathing ragged and shallow. He was an outcast, just as she was. He was bleeding and she was broken. He was dying in this forgotten shack, and she was dying on the main street of Obsidian Ridge. In that moment, their circumstances, though born of different worlds, felt unnervingly similar. Compassion and emotion she thought had been wrung out of her stirred in her chest. Her own troubles seemed to recede, replaced by an urgent, undeniable need to act. He was a human being, and he was suffering. "You're hurt," she said, her voice, barely a whisper, swallowed by the roar of the storm outside. He didn't respond with words, only a pained grunt as he tried to shift his position, and winced. Annalise set her jaw. She was the daughter of a country doctor. She had watched her father set bones and stitch wounds more times than she could count. She wasn't helpless. She tore a long strip from the hem of her finest petticoat, the one she had saved for her wedding. The irony was a bitter pill, but there was no time for it. She approached him slowly, her hands held out to show she meant no harm. "Let me help you. Please." The bleeding. He watched her, his dark eyes tracking her every move, suspicion warring with the fog of fever. When she knelt beside him, he flinched but didn't pull away. She gently, hesitantly peeled back the torn buckskin. The wound was deep, a ragged gash that looked like it had been caused by a piece of shrapnel or a ricocheting bullet. It was inflamed and angry. Working by the intermittent flashes of lightning, Annalise did what she could. She used another strip of her petticoat, soaked in the rainwater, pouring through a crack in the roof, to clean the wound as best she could. He bore the pain with a stoicism that stunned her. His only reaction, a tightening of his jaw and a hiss of breath through his teeth. She packed the wound with the cleanest cloth she had and bound it tightly with the remaining strips. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, exhausted. The man's breathing was still labored, but it seemed to have eased slightly. He slumped back against the wall, his eyes closing. A fragile, unspoken truce had been forged in the heart of the storm. Two outcasts, a disgraced woman, and a wounded warrior sharing the meager shelter of a forgotten shack bound by the universal languages of pain and compassion. The world had cast them both out, and in the darkness they had only each other. The storm passed as dawn broke, leaving the air washed clean and the world smelling of wet earth and sage. Inside the shack, a fragile peace held. Annalise had not slept, choosing instead to keep vigil, periodically bathing the stranger's forehead with cool rainwater to fight the fever that gripped him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words in a language she did not understand, his body trembling with chills. For 3 days, this was their rhythm. Annalise tended to his wound, changing the crude bandages and forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. The small store of biscuits and dried meat in her trunk was their only sustenance. She rationed it carefully, giving him the larger share. He was a big man, and if he was to heal, he would need his strength. On the 4th morning, she awoke to find him watching her. The delirium had passed from his eyes, replaced by a keen, intelligent awareness. The fever had broken. He was still weak, but he was lucid. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low, rough rasp. Annalise startled, not having heard him speak a clear word before. "My name is Annalise Schmidt." He considered this for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "This is a dangerous place for a woman alone." "I am aware," she said, a hint of bitterness in her tone. He pushed himself into a sitting position, gritting his teeth against the pain in his side. He looked at the clean white bandage, the remnants of her petticoat, and then back at her. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "You helped me," he stated. It wasn't a question or an expression of gratitude, but a simple acknowledgement of fact. "You were unwell," she replied, unsure what else to say. "My name is Kalen," he said, finally offering a piece of himself, and with that, the foundation of their strange cohabitation was laid. Annalise. Kalen. 2 names in an empty world. Their interactions were spare, punctuated by long stretches of a silence that was not awkward, but functional. They were 2 people focused on the grim business of survival. As Kalen's strength returned, a new routine began to form. He was a man of immense capability. He disappeared for hours at a time, moving with a ghost-like silence that belied his size and his injury, and would return with a rabbit or a pair of quail which he would skin and prepare with practiced efficiency. Annalise, in turn, took charge of their makeshift home. She found a rusty bucket and used it to haul water from a small spring she discovered a 1/4 mile away. She gathered firewood, cooked the meat Kalen provided over their small fire, and used her sewing kit to meticulously repair the tears in his buckskin shirt and her own clothing. One evening, as she was mending his shirt, Kalen watched her, his expression thoughtful. Her belly was beginning to swell, the gentle curve now unmistakable beneath her dress. "The child's father?" he asked, his tone neutral. Annalise's hands stilled. The needle paused mid-stitch. She didn't look at him as she spoke, her voice quiet and heavy with memory. "His name was Robert. We were to be married. He worked on the railroad. There was a blasting accident." She took a shaky breath. "His family. They were not kind. They have influence. They said I had shamed them. I had no prospects, no family of my own to turn to. Coming west seemed like the only way to give my baby a life. Caelan remained silent, absorbing her story without judgment. He did not offer platitudes or false comfort. He simply listened, and in his quiet acceptance, Annalise felt a greater sense of solace than she had from any words of pity. He saw her not as a sinner or a fool, but as someone who had done what was necessary to survive. He of all people could understand that. Meanwhile, Bartholomew Finch was not a man to leave things to chance. His public humiliation of Annalise had been a calculated display of his power and his unassailable moral standing in the community he sought to dominate. He controlled the only reliable well held the deed to the largest mining claim, and was the sole partner of the freight company that supplied the town. Obsidian Ridge was his fiefdom. He sent one of his hired men, a lanky, mean-eyed man named Jasper, to patrol the outskirts of town. The official reason was to watch for claim jumpers, but the true purpose was to ensure the fallen woman had moved on. Jasper found the tracks leading to the ravine. He saw the faint wisp of smoke from the shack's crumbling chimney. He reported back to Finch, who stroked his mustache, a cruel smile playing on his lips. A squatter, Finch mused. Living in filth, no doubt. The elements will take care of her soon enough. See that no one from town offers her aid. Remind them who signs their credit slips at the general store. The threat was clear. Anyone who helped Annalise Schmidt would face the wrath of Bartholomew Finch. Her isolation was to be complete, a slow, lingering death sentence of starvation and exposure. But Finch had not accounted for the shadow in the shack with her. He had not accounted for Caelan. Word of Annalise's survival trickled back into Obsidian Ridge like a foul seepage. Jasper, never one for subtlety, made it known that the mail-order bride was holed up in the old line shack, living like an animal. The town's reaction was a cold, collective shunning. Mrs. Gable declared it a divine judgment proof of the woman's inherent sinfulness. The Reverend Michael preached a fiery sermon on the wages of moral decay, his eyes seeming to bore into every woman in the congregation. But beneath the public condemnation, tiny seeds of doubt and sympathy began to sprout in the town's stony soil. Doc Hemlock felt a persistent pang of guilt. He had been the one to pronounce the verdict that condemned Annalise. He knew the dangers a pregnant woman faced without proper shelter or nutrition. Late one night, under the cloak of a moonless sky, he packed a small canvas bag with dried herbs for fever, a bottle of laudanum for pain, and a packet of precious quinine. He rode his horse to the edge of the ravine and left the bundle by a distinctive, lightning-scarred juniper tree, a place where it might be found by someone gathering wood. It was a small act of rebellion, a balm for his own conscience. In the smoky confines of the Gilded Spur saloon, a woman named Maeve polished glasses and listened. Maeve had seen her share of hardship. She knew what desperation could drive a woman to, and she didn't believe for a second that Annalise was the venomous viper Finch had painted her to be. She heard the cruel jokes and loud boasts of men like Jasper, and her heart hardened against them. She began leaving a small bowl of leftover stew or a half loaf of bread near the back door of the saloon each night, hoping a stray dog or a desperate woman might find it. These small secret kindnesses were flickers of light in a vast darkness. Annalise and Caelan knew nothing of them. Their world was the shack, the ravine, and the daily struggle for existence. Caelan, however, knew he could not hunt and trap in the immediate vicinity forever. The game would grow scarce, and their presence would become too obvious. He needed to trade to acquire things they could not make, or find salt flour, perhaps a real needle and thread. He traveled to a trading post a full day's ride away, a place where faces were transient and questions were few. He took with him several perfectly cured rabbit pelts, and a magnificent bobcat skin. While waiting for the trader to assess his wares, he stood in the shadows of the porch, listening to the conversations of prospectors and travelers. It was there he heard the story. Two men fresh from Obsidian Ridge were talking over a game of checkers. "Can you believe that Finch fellow," one said, "spitting a stream of tobacco juice? Runs that town like his own personal kingdom. Publicly shames his mail-order bride, throws her out on the street, pregnant, and forbids anyone from helping her. Calls her a harlot. I heard that too," the other man replied. "Heard she's shacked up with some wild Indian out in the rocks. A real scandal. Finch is courting Henrietta Sterling now, old man Sterling's daughter. Trying to merge his mining interests with Sterling's railroad money. Can't have a pregnant cast-off tarnishing his reputation." Caelan's face remained a mask of impassivity, but a cold fire ignited in his chest. He had heard Annalise's quiet, pain-filled version of the story. Now he was hearing the world's version, a twisted, cruel narrative designed by a man of immense ego. He understood now that Finch's cruelty was not a spontaneous act of anger, but a calculated political maneuver. Annalise was a pawn, a sacrifice, on the altar of his ambition. The knowledge settled deep within him, solidifying a protective instinct that had been steadily growing. He saw with perfect clarity that Annalise was not just a woman he was helping to survive. She was a person he was honor-bound to defend. She had saved his life with no thought for her own safety, tending to him when she believed him to be a dangerous savage. She had shown him an honor that the so-called civilized men in town could not comprehend. He finished his trade, acquiring a small sack of flour, a block of salt, and a sharp skinning knife. On his way back, he made a detour, his eyes scanning the ground. He found the tracks of Doc Hemlock's horse near the ravine. He followed them to the juniper tree and discovered the canvas bag. He inspected the contents, his expression unreadable. He recognized the herbs for what they were, medicine. When he returned to the shack, he placed the bag before Annalise without a word. She opened it, her eyes widening in disbelief at the sight of the carefully wrapped supplies. "Where did this come from?" she whispered, looking up at him. "There are those in the town who have a conscience," Caelan said simply. "It just runs quieter than their fear." Annalise clutched the bag to her chest, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. It wasn't just medicine. It was a message. They were not entirely alone. The whispers in Obsidian Ridge were not all cruel. In the hearts of a few, a quiet rebellion was brewing. But it was Finch's voice that still roared the loudest, and they both knew his fury was a storm that had not yet broken. The first snows of winter came early, dusting the tops of the mazes with a layer of white, and bringing a biting wind that sliced through the shoddy walls of the line shack. Annalise, now heavy with child, spent her days patching the chinks in the logs with a mixture of mud and dry grass, a task Caelan had taught her. The world had shrunk to the size of their small shelter, the warmth of their fire, and the steady, quiet presence of one another. One afternoon, as Annalise was stirring a thin rabbit stew over the fire, a sharp, debilitating pain seized her. It clamped down on her belly, stealing her breath and forcing her to cry out, dropping the spoon with a clatter. Caelan was outside, splitting firewood. He was inside the shack in 3 long strides, his face etched with concern. "What is it, the baby?" She gasped, clutching her stomach, as another wave of pain washed over her. "It's too soon. It's not time yet." But the baby had its own schedule. The pains began coming faster, stronger, leaving her weak and trembling in the intervals between. Panic, cold and stark began to set in. She was miles from a doctor, with only a man who knew nothing of childbirth to help her. Caelan, however, was a rock. The situation was foreign to him, but the core of it, a life-or-death struggle, was familiar territory. His calm was a strange and powerful anchor in her sea of fear and pain. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice, low and steady, as he helped her lie down on the cot he had built, piled high with their spare blankets and his own furs for warmth. Like the wind through the pines, slow, steady. The labor was long and brutal. Annalise's world narrowed to the crushing waves of contractions, the sweat on her brow, and Kaelin's constant reassuring presence. He boiled water, though he didn't seem to know why, only that it was something that was done. He bathed her face with a cool cloth. He held her hand, his grip firm and unwavering, letting her squeeze until her knuckles were white. He spoke to her not with empty platitudes, but with quiet observations of the natural world. "The hawk does not fear the updraft," he murmured, as a particularly vicious contraction crested. "It uses the wind to climb higher. Use this pain. It is bringing your child." Hours bled into a nightmarish eternity. Annalise was exhausted, her strength failing. She felt herself begin to drift, to give in to the darkness that nibbled at the edges of her vision. "I can't," she sobbed, her voice raw. "I can't do it." Kaelin leaned close, his face inches from hers. His dark eyes were intense, demanding. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice imbued with a certainty that cut through her despair. "You crossed a continent alone. You survived the judgment of lesser men. You saved my life. You are stronger than anyone in that town of stone. Now you will bring this child into the world. You will." His belief in her became her own. She drew on a reserve of strength she never knew she possessed. With a final agonizing push and a raw-throated scream that seemed to tear her in two, the baby was born. For a moment, there was a terrifying silence, broken only by Annalise's ragged gasps. Then, a thin, wavering cry filled the small shack. It was a cry not of weakness, but of fury and defiance, a cry that declared its existence to the harsh, indifferent world. It was a boy. Small but perfectly formed, with a tuft of dark hair and fists that were already clenched. Kaelin, with a surprising gentleness, cleaned the infant and wrapped him in the softest deerskin he had. He laid the baby in Annalise's arms. She stared down at her son, tears of pain and exhaustion replaced by tears of overwhelming, fierce love. He was real. He was here. They had survived. Kaelin stoked the fire, his movements economical and precise. He looked at the mother and child bathed in the warm, flickering light. A profound shift had occurred in the small cabin. It was no longer a temporary shelter for two survivors. It was a home. Annalise looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I have no name for him." Kaelin came and stood beside her, looking down at the tiny red-faced infant. The child's cry, though weak, had been full of fight. "In the stories of my people," Kaelin said softly, "and in the stories of yours, the lion is a creature of courage, of strength. He looks small, but his spirit is loud." He paused, then spoke the name, as if it were an invocation. "Leo." Annalise tested the name on her tongue. "Leo," she whispered. It was perfect. Strong and simple. A name for a fighter. Kaelin then did something that stunned her. He reached out a tentative hand and gently touched the baby's cheek with one finger. A look of profound tenderness and fierce possession crossed his features. "He is your son, Annalise," said softly. Kaelin looked from the baby to her, his gaze direct and unwavering, sealing a vow more sacred than any spoken in a church. "He is our son," he corrected. "I am his father. Let no man ever say otherwise." In that moment, he was not simply offering a name or a comforting lie. He was claiming them. He was declaring himself the protector of this tiny, fragile family, a father not by blood, but by honor, courage, and a bond forged in the crucible of shared survival. The birth of the child did not remain a secret for long. Jasper, making one of his sneering patrols, saw the tiny clothes Annalise had washed and hung to dry on a bush. He galloped back to town, bursting into Finch's office with the news. "She's whelped," he announced, a cruel grin splitting his face. "The harlot and the savage have a brat." Bartholomew Finch's teacup rattled in its saucer. The news was an irritant, a loose thread in the perfect tapestry of his life he was weaving. His courtship of Henrietta Sterling was proceeding splendidly. They were discussing wedding dates. The last thing he needed was the continued existence of the woman he had so publicly cast out, a living, breathing reminder of a scandal he considered long buried. Her survival, and now the child's, felt like a personal affront, a defiance of his will. "This cannot stand, Finch," said his voice, a low hiss. He stood and began to pace his hands, clasped behind his back. "It reflects poorly on me. It suggests I was unable to manage a simple domestic matter. Sterling values strength and decisiveness. But there was something more, a darker current running beneath his bruised ego. Annalise Schmidt was a link to a past he had worked diligently to erase. The story Annalise had told Kaelin was the truth, but it was an incomplete truth. Her fiancé Robert had not just been a railroad worker. He had been a junior partner in an engineering firm back in Ohio, a brilliant young man with a promising future. And he had been Bartholomew Finch's business rival. They had competed for the same lucrative bridge contract, a contract that Robert, through skill and ingenuity, had been poised to win. Finch, even then, a man who could not abide defeat, had not left it to chance. He had arranged a small act of sabotage at the blasting site, nothing that could be traced back to him, of course. Just a faulty fuse, a premature detonation, a tragic accident. With Robert gone, Finch had secured the contract and used the profits to establish his empire in Obsidian Ridge. Months later, when he'd seen Annalise Schmidt's name in a mail-order bride catalogue, a catalogue he perused for sport, he had been struck by a bolt of malevolent inspiration. He recognized the name. To bring his dead rival's grieving, pregnant fiancée west under the pretense of marriage, only to publicly destroy her, it was the ultimate victory. It wasn't just about humiliation. It was about eradicating the very last piece of Robert's legacy. He had never intended to marry her. He had intended to break her. Her resilience, her survival with the help of an Apache outcast, was a shocking and infuriating epilogue to his perfect crime. Jasper Finch said, his eyes gleaming with a cold reptilian light, "Gather a few of the boys. We are going to evict some squatters from my property. The line shack sits on the edge of my claim. It is a matter of law. And the woman and the kid." Jasper asked, his hand drifting to the pistol on his hip. "They are trespassers. How you remove them is a matter of discretion," Finch replied, the implicit violence hanging in the air. They rode out as the sun was low, casting long, menacing shadows. They found Kaelin outside the shack, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. He saw them coming and rose to his feet, the knife held loosely at his side. He was not intimidated. He simply stood between the riders and the door to the cabin, a silent, immovable guardian. Annalise, hearing the horses, appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her arms wrapped protectively around the small bundle that was Leo. Finch Kaelin said, his voice flat. Savage Finch sneered from his saddle. "I am here to reclaim my property. You and this harlot have 10 minutes to gather your things and disappear. If you are still here when I count to 10, my men will remove you by force." "This is not your land," Kaelin stated calmly. "It belongs to no one and everyone." Finch laughed, a condescending, ugly sound. "Possession is the only law that matters out here, and I possess everything as far as the eye can see, including the life of that woman you're protecting." He turned his cruel gaze on Annalise. "Did you ever wonder why I chose you, my dear?" He purred, his voice dripping with venom. "Out of all the pathetic, desperate women in that little book, it was your name. Schmidt, fiancé of the late Robert. A pity about his accident. He was clumsy, but his clumsiness made me a very rich man." Annalise stared at him, comprehension dawning in a wave of sickening horror. It hadn't been random. This monstrous cruelty, the public, shaming, the rejection, it had all been planned. He hadn't just rejected her. He had hunted her. You killed him," she whispered the words, catching in her throat. "I merely removed an obstacle," Finch said with a shrug, "just as I am about to remove another. I brought you here to be an example, to be a ghost, but you insisted on surviving. A terrible inconvenience." He nodded to Jasper. "Time's up." Jasper and 2 other men dismounted, spreading out to flank Kalen. They drew their pistols, the clicks of the hammers being cocked, echoing in the tense silence. But Kalen was not a man who waited for his enemies to set the terms of battle. As Jasper took his first step forward, Kalen moved. He was not a brawler. He was a warrior. He threw the skinning knife with a flick of his wrist. It wasn't aimed to kill, but to disable. The blade buried itself deep in the thigh of the man on the right, who screamed and collapsed, his pistol firing harmlessly into the sky. In the same motion, Kalen lunged not at Jasper, but at the horses. With a powerful sweep of his arm, he slapped the rump of Finch's magnificent stallion. The horse, startled and panicked, reared violently. Finch, a businessman and not a horseman, was thrown from the saddle landing in an undignified heap in the dirt. The balance of power had shifted in less than 5 seconds. The scene shattered into chaos. Jasper, his smug confidence replaced by a look of pained surprise, raised his pistol, the barrel wavering as he tried to draw a bead on the blur of motion that was Kalen. Annalise, standing in the doorway with Leo clutched to her chest, felt a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. This was not the timid, hopeful woman who had stepped off the stagecoach. This was a mother protecting her young. Her eyes darted around, landing on the cast-iron skillet sitting near the fire pit. Without a second thought, she lunged, grabbing its heavy handle and slinging it with all her might. The skillet spun through the air like a black discus, striking Jasper's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone and metal. His pistol flew from his grasp, and he howled in pain, cradling his shattered fingers. Kalen, seeing the opening Annalise had created, did not hesitate. He moved past the stunned man and delivered a hard, precise blow to the side of his jaw. Jasper's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed into the dust like a puppet with its strings cut. The third hired man, a young buck who was paid to intimidate, not to fight a real battle, saw his 2 companions neutralized in seconds. He looked at the screaming, wounded man on the ground, the unconscious Jasper, and the silent, deadly figure of Kalen, turning his attention to him. Terror won out over loyalty. He scrambled onto his horse, kicking it into a frantic gallop, and fleeing back toward the false security of town without a single backward glance. Bartholomew Finch struggled to his feet, his fine, tailored suit now a ruin of dust and wrinkles. The carefully constructed facade of the untouchable town patriarch had been violently stripped away, revealing the sputtering, impotent man beneath. His face was a mask of apoplectic fury, his complexion a blotchy, alarming red. All his life, his money and his name had bent the world to his will. This defiance, this utter and complete loss of control, was anathema to him. Insolent animals, he shrieked, his voice cracking with a rage that bordered on madness. He fumbled inside his coat, his hand emerging with a small, pearl-handled derringer, a gentleman's weapon, a coward's last resort. "I will kill you all. I'll burn this shack to the ground with your bastards' bones inside it." He raised the small pistol, its barrel a dark, menacing eye. It wasn't pointed at Kaelin, the clear and present physical threat. In a final act of supreme cruelty, he aimed it squarely at Annalise and the tiny innocent bundle she held in her arms. For Finch, the true insult was her survival, her happiness. It was the child, the living legacy of the man he had murdered, that he needed to erase. Annalise froze her body, instinctively turning to shield Leo. Kaelin started to move, but he knew he was too far away. The distance was impossible to cross in time. The world seemed to slow the moment, stretching into a silent, horrifying eternity. A single sharp crack echoed through the ravine, loud and definitive. It was not the pop of Finch's derringer. It was the powerful report of a rifle. Finch's pistol was violently knocked from his hand, spinning through the air before landing uselessly in the dirt several feet away. He cried out, staring at his stinging, empty hand in disbelief. At the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the fading light of the evening sky, were two figures on horseback. The first was Sheriff Brody, his face a grim, unreadable mask, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Beside him sat Doc Hemlock, a smoking hunting rifle held steady in his hands. It was the doctor, the quiet man of science and healing who had fired the shot. "That's enough, Bartholomew." The sheriff called out, his voice calm, but carrying an iron authority that had been absent for far too long. "It's over." Finch spun around his face, a mess of confusion and betrayal. "Brody, what is the meaning of this? That savage attacked me. He and this woman are trespassing. Arrest them. I'm afraid not." Doc Hemlock said, his own voice ringing with a newfound strength, cleansed by the righteous act he had just committed. He and the sheriff had followed Finch from town, the doctor's conscience screaming at him that Finch's errand was not about law, but about annihilation. "We came over the ridge just as you were making your confession. We heard every word. About a young engineer named Robert. About a tragic accident back in Ohio. About why you brought this poor woman all the way out here just to be a trophy in your sick game." The sounds of the confrontation had drawn others. Peeking over the edge of the ravine were the faces of Obsidian Ridge. Maeve from the saloon was there. Her arms crossed a look of grim, profound satisfaction on her face. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Gustav, stood with his wife, his huge hands clenched into fists, his eyes burning with shame for his own inaction. And there at the forefront was Mrs. Gable, her mouth agape, her face a canvas of utter shock, the man she had championed as the pillar of their community. The moral arbiter was a murderer and a monster. Her entire world was crumbling before her eyes. Finch saw them. He saw the judgment, the disgust, the pity in their eyes, where fear and deference had once lived. He saw his kingdom of influence built on a foundation of carefully managed lies and economic threats, dissolving like sand in a flash flood. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was just a cornered snake. With a desperate animalistic cry, he lunged for the pistol Kaelin had kicked away earlier. But Kaelin was on him in an instant. There was no fury in Kaelin's movements, only an efficient final purpose. He pinned the sputtering, defeated man to the ground, holding him with an ease that highlighted the pathetic nature of Finch's struggle, until Sheriff Brody clambered down the incline and snapped the cold, hard steel of handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click was the loudest sound in the world, a definitive full stop to Finch's reign. As Sheriff Brody hauled Bartholomew Finch to his feet and began the long, ignominious march back to the town jail, A profound silence fell over the ravine. The townsfolk parted to let them pass, their gazes following the disgraced man. Annalise stood in the doorway of her humble shack, clutching Leo to her chest, the tears she had held back for months finally tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. They were tears not of sorrow, but of a relief so immense it was physically painful. Slowly Doc Hemlock approached his rifle, now held loosely at his side. He stopped a few feet away, taking off his hat and twisting the brim in his hands. "Miss Schmidt," he began, his voice thick with a remorse that was deep and genuine. "Words are inadequate. My silence made me complicit in your suffering. For my part, in this, and on behalf of a town that let fear rule its conscience, I am truly and deeply sorry." Annalise could only nod her throat too tight for words. Maeve was next. She came forward and gently placed a thick, clean wool blanket over Annalise's shoulders. "No woman should be alone at a time like this," she said softly, her eyes meeting Annalise's in a moment of shared understanding that transcended their different lives. Then came Gustav the blacksmith, a man whose physical power was matched only by his usual taciturn nature. He stood before Kaelin, looking not at the Apache man as a savage, but as a warrior who had defended the helpless. "This shack ain't fit for a family," Gustav stated, his voice a low rumble. "Winter's coming on proper. Me and the boys. We'll see to it." He gave a curt, respectful nod and retreated. In the weeks that followed, the ravine became a place not of exile, but of construction. True to his word, Gustav led a small army of volunteers. The sounds of hammers and saws filled the air from sunup to sundown. They laid a new solid floor. They replaced the crumbling walls with sturdy, well-jointed pine logs, chinked tight against the wind. A proper stone chimney rose, and a real glass-paned window was set in the wall, allowing the morning sun to spill into the room. Kaelin worked alongside them, his quiet competence and knowledge of the land earning him a silent, grudging respect that slowly blossomed into genuine admiration. They were rebuilding more than a shack. They were rebuilding the town's own broken honor. Annalise in turn fed them, making stews and baking bread in a new stove donated by the general store owner. She was no longer the outcast, but a quiet, central figure in the community's act of atonement. She watched as Leo was passed from the gentle hands of the blacksmith's wife to the awkward, tender hold of a grizzled old prospector. Her son would not grow up in shame. He would be raised by a village that was learning how to be a community again. Months later, the house was finished. It was no longer a shack, but a snug, warm cabin filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. A small garden protected from the deer held the promise of spring. One evening, as the first stars pricked the deep purple of the sky, Annalise stood with Kaelin by the window, watching their son sleeping peacefully in a sturdy cradle Gustav had carved himself. Leo was growing strong, his cheeks full, his dark tuft of hair now a thick thatch. "I used to dream of a fine, grand house," Annalise said softly, leaning her head against Kaelin's strong shoulder, "like the one Finch had. I thought that was what a home was. A cage made of gold is still a cage," Kaelin replied, his arm wrapping around her, a familiar and comforting weight. "This is a home," she whispered, her heart full. "You built this. We built this." She looked up at him, her love for this quiet, honorable man shining in her eyes. "He will grow up knowing what a father truly is. He will have your strength, your courage. And he will have your heart, Annalise Kaelin," said his voice soft but firm, "which is stronger than any stone or steel in this land. He will need both." They stood together in the comfortable silence, two survivors who had been thrown away by the world, only to find everything they needed in each other. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song, across the vast, indifferent wilderness. But inside the small cabin, bathed in the warm, gentle light of the fire, a family was safe. They had faced down the worst of men and the harshest of lands, and in a place that had offered them only rejection and ruin, they had built their own redemption. Annalise and Caelan's story reminds us that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the bonds you forge in the fire of adversity. It proves that true character is not measured by wealth or status, but by compassion in the face of cruelty. Their journey from shunned outcasts to the heart of a healing community is a testament to the idea that a home is not a place you find, but something you build from the broken pieces of a life you thought was over. With courage and honor, they rewrote their own destinies, creating a legacy of love for their son, Leo. If their powerful story of survival honor and the creation of an unlikely family moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story where true justice prevails, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable tales from the untamed frontier. Your support allows us to continue bringing these incredible stories to life. Thank you for listening.